Hello, this is Basim. I'm the lead developer at FillQuick, and in this video, I will show you an overview of our REST API, and I will explain how it can be used by client applications to create leads on FillQuick. So I'll start by showing you how to get a user ID and an API key for one of your users. And to do that, I will go to Users from the left menu, and I'll click on List under Users. And I will click the name of one of my users, for example, Sample Multi-Role Manager. And I'll click the API integration tab on top, and then I'll click this blue button that says enable API integration. You will see this will get me a user ID and an API key. And this is the information that will be used by the client application to authenticate itself. It's just like the email and password that's used by human users to log in. Applications, instead of using an email and a password, they use a user ID and an API key to authenticate themselves. And the way they submit this authentication information to the API is using a scheme called the basic authentication scheme. Basic authentication, this is a very simple standard internet protocol. So regardless of which technology you're using to build your client application, I'm sure it will have support for basic authentication, and you'll be able to call APIs and authenticate yourself using basic authentication. And also, I'd like to clarify that any application using this user ID and this API key to authenticate itself will be acting on behalf of this user, the user sample multi-role manager. So in your action log, you'll see something like sample multi-role manager created a lead. And this is because the application that created the lead, by submitting it to FillQuick via the API, it was acting on behalf of this user. So you may decide to enable the API integration for one of your human users, or maybe you will prefer to create a special user, call it something like API user, for example, and then get a user ID and an API key for this API user. So in your action log, it will say API user created the lead, and you will know that this lead was created by an application via the API. So now that I showed you how to get a user ID and an API key, the next thing I would like to show you is our API documentation page. So to go to the API documentation page, you will start by typing your FillQuick site address, and then at the end you will type /swagger, SWAGGER, your FillQuick site address /swagger. And this will open the API documentation page for you. You will see this page will have a list of endpoints that are exposed by this API, and will show you the verb that you use to call each of the endpoints. Like for example, this lead/new endpoint is called using the post verb. This other endpoint here is called using the get verb. And you can click any of the endpoints to expand it and see some additional details about the request and the expected responses. So I just click the lead/new endpoint. And by the way, that's the most important endpoint in this API. That's the endpoint that you use to create new leads. All the other endpoints are just to get you some information that you need to make this request to the lead/new endpoint. So let's take a closer look at lead/new. You will see that the request body is a JSON message. And here we have an example valid JSON request message. And you can switch between this example request and the schema of the request. The schema will give you a list of the properties that are supported by this request object. And for each of the properties, you will have the data type, and you may have some short description of this property that explains what it is and what it does. And any property that is required will have a red asterisk next to it. You'll see that the only required properties to create a new lead are the first name and the last name. So that's all what it takes to create a new lead via the API. Just provide the first name and last name. and you can use that to create a lead. All the other properties are optional. You may or may not provide them. Okay, and that's an example valid request. And after this request documentation, we have a documentation of all the possible responses that may be returned by the server. The server may return a response called 200, and this means that the request was processed successfully. And in the body of this response, of this 200 response, you'll get the new lead ID. This is the ID of the newly created lead. Another possible response that you may get from the server is a 400 response, and that's what you get if your request is invalid for some reason. Like maybe your request message has some invalid JSON in it, for example. It's not valid JSON syntax. Or maybe you did not provide the value for one of the required properties. Any of that will get you a 400 response, which means that your request is invalid. Another possible response is a 401 response, and this is what you get if the authorization fails. Just like we said earlier, you're required to provide this user ID and this API key in your request, and you provide them using the basic authorization scheme. So you need to provide an authorization header, and it needs to have this user ID and this API key encoded in it. If this authorization header is missing or is malformed, or maybe you provided an invalid user ID and API key combination, any of this will give you a 401 response, which means that your request could not be authorized. So yeah, we just looked at the documentation for the new lead endpoint. And next thing I want to show you is how to make requests to the server and see the server response from this same Swagger documentation page. So it's not only good for showing you the API documentation, but it is also a tool that enables you to send requests to the server. So to do that, to send a test request to the server, you click one of your endpoints, the one that you would like to try or use, and then you will see this button right here that says try it out. So you click the try it out button, and you will see that the example request will turn into a text area, and you will be able to edit your request message, change any of the property value or add or remove properties. And you will have a button here that says execute. This is to send the request to the server. So I will try clicking the execute button, and we just sent the request to the server, and this is the response that we got back. We got back a 401 response, which means that the authorization has failed. And this was expected because, as we said, we need to provide an authorization header with our user ID and then our API key. And we did not provide that in this request. And that's why it came back with the 401 unauthorized response. So what we need to do, we need to configure Swagger to use basic authentication and to use the user ID and API key that we got from the website. And the way we configure Swagger is by scrolling all the way to the top and then clicking this authorize button. And Swagger will ask us for a username and a password. Your username will be the user ID, 1 in this case. And the password will be the API key. So I'll copy it and I'll paste it. And then I will click on authorize. And that's it. We just configure Swagger to use this username and password, this user ID and this API key. And let's try sending this exact request another time, and let's see what happens this time. So I click the execute again. This is the exact same request, except this time we're sending an authorization header. And we got back a 200 response, which means that the request was processed successfully. And here is the ID of the newly created lead. So let's try to view this lead on the website. The ID is 1309. So I will go to leads and then list. And we see the first lead is John Doe. This is the same name that we submitted here from the Swagger page. The first name was John, last name Doe. So this is the lead that we see right here. I'll click the lead to go to the details page. You see that the lead source is door knocking, properties residential, name is John Doe, and that's the phone number, old phone number. This is the exact same information that we provided here in the request message. So yeah, that's perfect. We just made a successful request from the Swagger page, and we saw the lead which was created, and we were able to see it from the website. So now let's take a closer look and see these properties, consider each of the properties that are forming this request message. We will see that the first property is the lead source ID. And in our previous request, we chose the lead source ID 1, which gave us the lead source door knocking that we see here on the website. So the question is, how do we know the ID of the lead source we want to select? Let's say, for example, we want another lead source. We want the lead source website. How do we know the ID of the website lead source? Well, the way we know it is from another endpoint, from the lead source / list endpoint. The function of this endpoint is to give us a list of all the lead sources, their names and their IDs. So let's try calling this endpoint. And we see the documentation here. This is a very simple endpoint. It doesn't take any request parameters. There is no input to this endpoint. Just calling this URL using the get verb will get you the list of the lead sources. So let's try out this endpoint, execute. And that's the response we got from the server. We got a 200 response, which means that the request was processed successfully. And here is what we got in the response body. We got an array of lead sources. And for each of the lead sources, we have an ID and the name. So here it says that the door knocking lead source, it has an ID 1, and flyers has ID 3, and so on. So in our next request, we want to have the lead source website. So the ID of website is 4. So what I'll do, I'll copy this ID from here, and then I don't need this endpoint anymore, so I'll collapse it, and I will expand the new lead endpoint, and I will replace the lead source ID 1 by 4. Next thing, next property is a property called property type. This can be either residential or commercial. In our previous request, it was residential, and that's why we see here that the property type is residential. Another possible value is commercial. So your value of your property type property can be commercial. And if you choose a commercial property type, then you are required to provide a business name. So I'm adding a property called business name. And the value of the business name, let's call it my biz, for example. So yeah, that's the property type and the business name. And next we have the first name and the last name. And we said those are the only 2 required properties. So instead of Jean Doe, let's call it something else this time. Let's call it test 1. So the new lead will be called test 1. And next we have the phone number. FillQuick requires the phone number to have exactly 10 digits. So your phone number needs to have exactly 10 digits, and it can have any formatting character like these parentheses and these spaces, these dashes, they don't matter at all. All what matters is that your phone number needs to have 10 digits. And after the phone number, we have the phone type. This can be home, cell, or work. And if you're wondering where I'm getting these options from, these possible values from, well, I'm getting them from the documentation here. If we go to the schema, and if we go to the phone type, for example, it tells us that the type of this field is a string and it's an enumeration, and the possible values are home, cell, or work. So let's go back to our test request. Okay, so that's the phone number and the phone type. And we have alt phone number and alt phone type. And each of these properties, it corresponds to one of the fields on the lead form. So you see the lead form, it has a phone number field and a phone type, an alt phone number and alt phone type. And it has the address information. You can see, oh, sorry, it has email first. So this email will correspond to the email field on the lead form. And then it has the address information, address line 1, city, state, and zip, and the county, and the cross street. And it even has an address line 2, which we didn't submit in our previous request. So let's try submitting this now. And our address line 2 will be Sweet, for example. And we have a city, state, province abbreviation. This will be the 2-letter state or province abbreviation. We have the zip code, the county, and the cross street. And we have the social security number. And we have the date of birth. And this is the format for the date of birth. And actually, the time component is not required. Obviously, for a date of birth, you don't care about the time. So you can only submit the date component without the time component. And next we have the credit score and the credit tracking number. It's very unlikely that you will want to submit your credit information from the other system to FillQuick because most FillQuick users, they use FillQuick to run the credit check. But in case your other system already has the credit information, you can pass it with all the other lead information. And next we have the seller ID. In our previous request, we chose the seller ID 15, and this gave us the seller sample seller 1. So again, of course, you'll be asking how are we supposed to know the ID of the seller we want to select? Well, we have another endpoint for that, for getting you the list of sellers and their IDs. And this endpoint is the seller list endpoint right here. So this is another simple get endpoint that doesn't take any parameters. So we can try it out. We don't need to provide any input. We will just click on execute. And we just got a 200 success response from the server, and the response body has an array containing all the seller users on this FillQuick site, their names and their IDs. So let's say that for this new request, we want the lead to be assigned to the seller sample seller 6. So we will use the seller ID 20, which is the ID of sample seller 6. I will go back to my new lead endpoint, and I will go to the seller ID property, and I'll enter the seller ID 20. Next, we have the pipeline stage ID. In the first request, we chose the pipeline stage ID 1, which gave us, which put the lead in the stage lead in, pipeline stage called lead in. And apparently the ID of this lead in stage is 1. So how do we see the pipeline stages and their IDs? I'm sure you guessed it already. We have an endpoint for that. So The endpoint will be this one, delete pipeline stages / list. I will try this endpoint, execute it. And here are all the possible pipeline stages, their names and their IDs. So let's say that for this new request, we want to put the lead in the meeting arranged pipeline stage. So the ID of this pipeline stage will be 3. I will go to my lead request and I will replace the pipeline stage ID 1 by 3. Okay, next we have the tag IDs. You know, on FillQuick, you can add tags to leads and customers. In our previous request, we had the tag IDs 5 and 6. So this added the 2 tags, family / friends, and get new payment info. It added these 2 tags to the lead that we created. So, of course, we need to know the IDs of the tags we want to select, and we will just need to call the endpoint, the customer account tag / list endpoint. This will give us all the tags and their IDs. So I'll try out this endpoint and execute it. It doesn't take any input. And here is an array containing all the possible tags and their IDs. Let's say for this lead that we're about to submit right now, we just want the family / friend tag, which has the ID 5. So I will go to my new lead request, and in the array of tag IDs, I'll just provide one tag ID, which is 5. Of course, you can provide additional tag IDs, as many as you like. They just need to be all valid IDs. Or maybe you don't want any tags at all. So in this case, you can provide null as the value of this property if you don't want to add any leads to any tags to the new lead. But in this example, let's have one tag with the ID 5, which is the family / friend tag. Next property is the note. And this note will show in the notes section under lead. That's what we submitted in our previous request. The note says an example note, and you can see it here under the notes section, an example note. And if you do provide a note, you may also provide a value for another property, which is note visible to seller. And this will let you specify whether you want this note to be visible to the seller or not. In our last request, we said that yes, we want this note to be visible to the seller. And let's make sure that that's how it is. And yes, we see that this note is indeed visible to the seller. So in this new request, let's try something different. Instead of true, let's pass false. So on this new lead that we're about to create right now, the note should not be visible to the seller. Okay, so I'll try clicking on execute. Let's see what we got back from the server. We got a 200 response, perfect. This means success. And it gave us the new lead ID 1310. So let's view this lead from the website. I'll go to my leads list and I click on the test 1 lead that we just submitted from the Swagger page. And we see that the lead source is website, property type is commercial, business name is mybiz. This is all the information that we submitted in our request message. First name, last name, the phone numbers and the phone types, all the address information, the email and the social security number and the date of birth, the credit information, and it was assigned to the seller, sample seller 6. And you see it was put in the pipeline stage, meeting arranged, and the tag family / friend was added to this lead. And this note was added to, and it should not be visible to the seller. Perfect, it is not visible to the seller. Okay, the last thing I would like to show you is the Open API specification file for our API. You can get to this file from the Swagger documentation page. You'll scroll all the way to the top and you will click this swagger.json link here on the top left. And this is a JSON document that has a complete description of the API. It has all the endpoints and the format of the request and the response messages for each of the endpoints and all the possible server responses for each of the endpoints. And this Open API specification document, it can be used by the Swagger tools to generate a lot of the client-side code that you need to connect to our API. And these Swagger tools, they are available or they support many different programming languages. So it doesn't matter if you're using .NET or Java or Python or PHP. You'll be able to use the Swagger tools to generate client-side code for any of these languages. Okay, I believe I covered a lot in this video. And of course, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact our support team and we'll be very happy to help you. Thank you so much for watching this video and goodbye.